All right, so part one was a breakdown of every Washington football franchise starting quarterback from November 1985 up to January of 2022. As you look at Garrett Gilbert there, the last one featured in part one. Part two will consist of a comprehensive list and breakdown of every single quarterback of the Washington Redskins Washington football team during that same era who played during regular season or playoff games but never got a start for the franchise. And then I will list separately all of the quarterbacks during that time who at least suited up or were on the practice squad but never entered a regular season game. All right, so we'll start 1985 and 1986. There was nobody that was not featured in part one. So the first quarterback we'll talk about is a guy named Tony Robinson. So this was a guy who played for the University of Tennessee, and he was a good quarterback. In fact, he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated at one time, but there was a cocaine bust in January 1986, a few days after the 1986 Sugar Bowl, that derailed his draft status, so he was undrafted. However, he did receive offers to play for the Richmond Ravens of the Continental Interstate Football League while serving his sentence. And then he ended up playing for the Ravens in 1987. 1987 was the year that the NFL players went on strike. So I talked about this in the last video when we featured Ed Rubert, the one who had two starts during those weeks. And Tony Robinson was signed to be one of the scab players, as they called it, one of the replacement players. He was signed in September 1987 by Joe Gibbs to be the backup to Ed Rubert. Ed Rubert started all three of those games and was 3-0 as a starter. In the third game, it was a Monday Night Football game. Rubert went down with injury. This was Monday Night Football against the Dallas Cowboys, and the Redskins were playing with a roster entirely of replacement players, whereas the Cowboys were players. There were a number of them who had crossed the picket lines who were playing in that game. For example, Tony Dorsett, Too Tall Jones, and Randy White, and among others. So few people thought the Redskins had any chance of even being in this game. In the second quarter, Rubert was injured. Robinson, pictured here, entered the game, and he helped lead the Redskins to a 13-7 upset. He went 11 for 18. He did throw a pair of interceptions, but he threw for 152 yards, and he was praised for the way he handled the offense that night. And this went down as one of the greatest upsets in NFL history. So Robinson never appeared in another NFL game after this, but he did earn a Super Bowl ring as a contributor to the 1987 Redskins. Next is David Archer. So in 1988, Mark Rippon was starting at the time, and backup Doug Williams had emergency appendectomy surgery. This was Stan Humphrey's rookie year, which I believe he spent the entirety of on the practice squad or the injured reserve. I believe it was injured reserve. So as an insurance policy, during that season, the Redskins brought in David Archer, who was a one-time Falcon. He actually had 23 starts with Atlanta, and he was very young when they brought him in. He was only 26. He suited up briefly as an insurance policy, and during a game, or at the end of a game against the Phoenix Cardinals that year, in which Rippon started and they were blowing out Phoenix, David Archer entered the game and threw 2 passes, both incompletions in mop-up duty, and that was the only appearance by Archer. Okay, the next player is Brian Mitchell. He was a 5th-round pick out of southwestern Louisiana in 1990. At Southwestern Louisiana, he was a quarterback. He became the first player in NCAA history to pass for 5,000 yards and rush for 3,000 yards. When he came to the Redskins, he was a running back and mostly return specialist as well as a special teams player. He holds the NFL record for the most kickoff return yards, the most punt return yards, and the most total return yards. He should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. His rookie year, on an evening when the Redskins played the Philadelphia Eagles on Monday Night Football, which this became known as the body bag game. I referenced it in the first video, where Jeff Rutledge got the start at quarterback. He was injured. Stan Humphries replaced him. He was out. He suffered a knee injury, which took him out for the rest of the season. Mark Rippon was already injured. He was not suited up. And the insurance quarterback that they had signed, Gary Hogeboom, who I will mention later, was not dressed either. They went with just 2 quarterbacks that night. The emergency quarterback was Brian Mitchell, who, of course, had a lot of experience playing quarterback in college the previous season. Entered the game late. The Redskins were pretty much out of the game at that time, but Mitchell engineered a touchdown scoring drive in which he ran it in on the final play of the drive. He ran it in for a touchdown. He went 3 for 6, 40 yards passing on the drive. And from that point on, he was the emergency quarterback, but he never played QB in a game, or with the exception of some running back option passes. Next is Rodney Peete, and he's the best known full-time quarterback that will appear on this list of players who appeared in a game for the Skins but never got a start. Peete was a very good USC quarterback in the late 80s. He was drafted in the 5th round by the Detroit Lions in 1989. The Lions would then draft Andre Ware out of Houston in the 1990 draft with the 7th overall pick. He turned out to be one of the biggest busts in NFL history. Peete ended up getting 87 starts in his NFL career. Most of these came with Detroit, and then in the mid to late 90s with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was also on the 1994 Dallas Cowboys team and got 1 start there. That was the team that was attempting to win 3 Super Bowls in a row. Of course, they lost to San Francisco in the NFC Championship. With Philadelphia, he was a very capable starter there, as they were between Randall Cunningham and the drafting of Donovan McNabb. Peete came to the Redskins in 1999. That was the year that Brad Johnson was signed. It was an exciting signing, that being Brad Johnson, but he did have a history of he had a knee injury in the past. So Pete was signed as insurance, as a guy who could start some games if anything happened to Johnson. But Johnson was healthy that year. He ended up making all 16 starts. Now, when Rodney Peete entered the NFL in 1989, black quarterbacks in the NFL, it was a very rare thing. You had Warren Moon, Randall Cunningham, Doug Williams, and Vince Evans, who had some incredible longevity as a starter for the Bears and then a backup mostly for the Raiders. So Pete came in at that time. By the time he left the NFL in 2004, we had seen a dramatic shift where black quarterbacks such as Steve McNair, Donovan McNabb, Dante Culpepper, Michael Vick, all top 10 picks, and a couple busts in there too. Akili Smith, Byron Leftwich coming to the league. So Rodney Peete's career straddled both of those eras, and he's often overlooked in that first era as one of those quarterbacks. By 1999, 10 years into the league, he had a lot of experience, and his performance with the Redskins included the final game of the season, which was January of 2000, against the Miami Dolphins. This was a game that the Redskins did not need to win. They had the division locked up, and I believe the Dolphins did not need to win it either because the Dolphins put in quarterback Damon Heward, replacing Dan Marino, which ended up being his last regular season game. Brad Johnson was replaced by Pete in that game. Pete threw for 2 touchdowns in the win over Miami. Earlier in the season, his other appearance was against the Chicago Bears. It was a blowout win for the Redskins over the Bears, and Pete was put in late in the game for mop-up duty. This is a very significant thing in Redskins franchise history because this was the last game where such a occurrence happened, where a backup quarterback was put into the game because they were blowing out the other team. This happened a few times in 1991, but to my knowledge, I cannot come up with any game since that Bears-Redskins 1999 game where they had the luxury of resting their starter in the second half or fourth quarter due to winning the game by so many points. I can think of examples where they were getting blown out and put in backups, like the Chiefs game back in 2013, I believe, Shanahan's last season. But this was the last time to date that this has happened. So Pete went to, after this one season with Washington, he went to the Raiders for a couple of years, and then he ended up closing out his career as a member of the Carolina Panthers, where he was a backup in Super Bowl 38, which the Panthers lost to New England. The 2000 draft was a exciting one for the Washington Redskins. With the second overall pick, they took LeVar Arrington out of Penn State, and with the third overall pick, they selected Chris Samuels, the left tackle, out of Alabama. In the sixth round of that draft, they selected Todd Husak out of Stanford University, and Husak attempted 2 passes for -2 yards in 2000, and he was released after the 2000 season. All right, this is Kent Graham. This is a guy who managed to drum up 38 career NFL starts. He was drafted by the Giants in 1992. He was there for the end of the Phil Simms era and then the transition period afterwards, in which Dave Brown got most of the starts there. Graham got some starts there as well before going to the Arizona Cardinals, starting some games for them. And then he came to the Redskins in 2001, the Marty Schottenheimer year, seen there on the left of Graham. Graham was a respected lunch pail backup who steered the Redskins to a victory over the Denver Broncos that year in relief of the injured Tony Banks. After 2001, Graham was out of the NFL. This is Rob Johnson, who is best known as the very popular backup to Mark Brunell in Jacksonville, who signed a lucrative contract with the Buffalo Bills in 1999. There was a lot of controversy when Doug Flutie played well that season for the Bills, and then Wade Phillips, the head coach, went with Johnson in the Music City Miracle playoff game. It was an ill-advised decision by Phillips. Flutie was incredibly popular in Buffalo, and Johnson was not. In 2003, the second and final year of the Steve Spurrier regime in Washington, they were done with Shane Matthews. They still had Danny Werfel and Patrick Ramsey. And to fill the third quarterback void, the Redskins signed Rob Johnson. He had just picked up a Super Bowl ring as a backup to Brad Johnson in Tampa. Rob Johnson appeared in one game for the Redskins in 2003. He completed 5 passes and was let go the next day and replaced with Tim Hasselbeck. Okay, Jabron Hamden is another guy from the 2003 final Spurrier season. Hamden was drafted in the 7th round in 2003 out of Indiana University. He spent most of the season on the practice squad before coming off the practice squad and being suited up for the final 5 games of that 5-11 dreadful season. He finally appeared in a game against the Philadelphia Eagles. I believe it was a Sunday night football game. He appeared in relief as they were getting blown out by the Eagles. He threw 2 passes, completed 1 pass for 7 yards. He was then released after that season and spent a number of years in NFL Europe and with other NFL teams, but he never threw another NFL pass after that December 2003 game. So that's the end of that list of Washington franchise quarterbacks who never started but appeared in regular season games. Next, we will discuss the Washington franchise quarterbacks who, at the very least, were on practice squads and or suited up for games between 1985 and January of 2022. The first one is a guy named Babe Laufenberg, and this is a guy he's the only one on this list who is, well, besides Jay Schrader, he's the only one on this list who's a holdover from when Joe Theismann was active as a player. And he might be the most famous Redskin to never play a down due to his shining in the preseason a number of times. Laufenberg was selected by the Redskins in the 6th round of the 1983 NFL draft. So that was a draft that had Elway, Kelly, Marino, a lot of greats. And it also had Babe Laufenberg. He came from Indiana, just like Jabron Hamden, the last quarterback that I've talked about. He played a little bit in he was drafted in the USFL draft as well. So as a rookie in 1983, I know we're going back, but just to give you some before 1985, but just to give you context, as a rookie in 83, he was inactive for every game, but he was the third string quarterback on the depth chart, and the team that reached Super Bowl 18, losing to Los Angeles Raiders. And the following year, 1985, he was on the injured reserve list with a shoulder. In 1985, he competed with Jay Schrader for the backup position behind Joe Theismann. Schrader won that job, and Laufenberg was placed on waivers after the team decided to keep only two quarterbacks on the roster. So in October of 85, Laufenberg was signed by the Chargers to be a backup there after Dan Fouts suffered a knee injury, but then he was cut a couple weeks later to make room for another quarterback. His second stint with the Redskins came on November the 21st, 1985. This is 3 days after the Theismann injury. He was signed as the primary backup to Jay Schrader, but he never appeared in a game that season. In 1986, he competed again for a backup position in the preseason against the recently signed Doug Williams and the recently drafted Mark Rippon. He was released in late August of that year, so he never appeared in a regular season game, but he was very popular with the fans and media. In fact, he was called Mr. August for his success in preseason games. He had a third stint with the Redskins in 1987. September 14th, he was signed to serve as Williams' backup after Schrader sprained his shoulder in the season opener. But right after that, the players went on strike, and the NFL decided they would go with replacement players. So Babe Laufenberg did not cross the picket line, and he was released when Schrader returned to the lineup and when the players came back on October the 27th. So because he was only on the roster in 1987 for 2 games, he missed out on getting a Super Bowl share by 1 game. The next one is Steve Bartkowski, easily the most accomplished starting quarterback on this Part 2 list. So Bartkowski was the number 1 pick way back in the 1975 NFL draft, number 1 overall. Out of Cal, he held the many Atlanta Falcons career passing yard marks for many years before most of them have been broken recently by Matt Ryan. Bartkowski was brought in November of 1985 after Theismann's had the injury. He was an insurance policy for when Jay Schrader had a bad rib. He was behind Babe Laufenberg, but he never appeared in a game. He suited up, but he never appeared in a game that season. He did manage to get 6 starts the next season with the Los Angeles Rams after Dieter Brock had a season-ending injury, but they turned it over to rookie Jim Everett that year. So we go from the number 1 overall pick in a draft, Bartkowski, to Mr. Irrelevant. This is Bill Kinney, who was the final pick in the 1978 draft by the Miami Dolphins. He never played with the Dolphins. For a Mr. Irrelevant, he had a very solid NFL career. He managed 77 starts in the NFL, all with the Kansas City Chiefs. He was a Pro Bowl selection in 1983. And in 1989, he was signed as Washington's 3rd quarterback behind Mark Rippon and Doug Williams. He never appeared in a game that year as they pushed to elevate Stan Humphries from the practice squad, who He appeared in a game against the Raiders that season. Kenny did not appear in a game that year. He did not appear in a game at all after that. He retired after 1989. Next is Gary Hogeboom, and like Kenny, I can't find a picture of him in a Redskins uniform, but trust me, he was with him. Hogeboom was a 1980 draft pick by the Dallas Cowboys. He spent much of his career as a backup to Danny White. Then he played some with the Colts and the Cardinals. He managed 37 starts in the NFL. He was brought in 1990 as insurance after Mark Rippon was injured. This was September of 1990. He was brought in for depth purposes. He was released. He was seen on the sidelines, or shown by cameras on the sidelines, in the body bag game against Philadelphia that year, after Rutledge and Humphreys went down with injury. They showed him that he was inactive. He was in street clothes, and that's when Brian Mitchell came in. They could have used Hogeboom that evening. But he was released on December 28th to make room for defensive tackle Tracy Rocker. Next is Jeff Brom, and this is one who was an undrafted free agent out of Louisville who went to the Chargers originally in 1994. He came to the Redskins in 1995. Now, this is one where I'm not sure if he ever suited up for the Redskins. I know that year they had Heath Shuler, Gus Frerotte, and Trent Green his first year as the third stringer there. Wikipedia lists Jeff Brom as being an off-season signing and or practice squad member. So I will include practice squad people on this list. I don't like to include people who signed in the off-season but were cut a couple weeks later, or who showed up to May mini camps and then left, or a couple of hired hands that came in and competed a little bit in the preseason workouts but never suited up for preseason games. I don't like to include those people on this list, but since it's possible that Jeff Brom was suited up for at least one game in 1995, while someone like, say, Shuler or Trent Green were inactive, I will show him here. He ended up having 353 yards passing in his NFL career, all with the 49ers, 1996 to 97. He's the older brother of Brian Brom, who had a similar career in the NFL. Okay, Casey Weldon was a successful Florida State quarterback in the late 80s and early 90s. He was the runner-up Heisman winner to Desmond Howard in 1991. Now back then, as successful as Florida State football was, the quarterbacks were not taken very seriously as far as the NFL draft. Weldon was taken in the 4th round by the Eagles in 1992, and he played sparingly with Tampa Bay after that for a few years. Now, Wikipedia lists him being on the Redskins from 1998 to 2000. I believe that is incorrect. In 1998, as I have gone through on these videos, 1998, the quarterbacks for the Redskins were Heath Shuler, Gus Frerotte, and the newly acquired Trent Green. The quarterbacks in 2000 were Brad Johnson, Jeff George, and Todd Husak, who had just been drafted. I believe this is incorrect, that Weldon was any part of the Redskins in 1998 or 2000.
Now, he was definitely there in 1999, and this is one where I've made a mistake. Have thought for years that he was the third string quarterback in 1999 behind Brad Johnson and Rodney Peete, which he was. And ironically, Brad Johnson was Weldon's backup at Florida State. But that season, Weldon appeared in a 50-21 blowout over the Giants in Week 2. In that game, Weldon did not throw any passes, but he did have 3 rushes for -2 yards. I assume these are kneel downs, and I assume also that he probably handed the ball off a couple times. He also appeared in the January 2000 final regular season game against Miami, in which Rodney Peete played most of the second half. Weldon also entered that game late and had 0 pass attempts, but he had 2 rushing attempts for -2 yards. I believe these are also kneel downs. So he did appear on the field as a Washington Redskin for 2 games. Casey Weldon. Okay, I'm going to go backwards a little bit here. This is Chris Hakel. Now, he was a 4th round pick, which is pretty high by the Redskins, and back in 1992, the last draft of the first Joe Gibbs coaching tenure. Now, he did have a connection there because he went to William and Mary University, and one of Gibbs' sons was a player and also a coach for William and Mary. He did have a very good season his senior year. Hakel was taken that in '92 by the Redskins. He spent the year on the injured reserve, so that's why I'm including him. In the 1993 preseason, he was given another shot by the Redskins, but he did not make the team or even the practice squad. He was released and signed by the Falcons and spent a year on their practice squad, and then managed to find a home on the Chiefs for a year as the 3rd stringer behind Joe Montana. Also going back, this is Jamie Martin. So he was originally undrafted out of Weber State in 1993 by the then Los Angeles Rams. So his time with the Redskins was 1997 as a 3rd stringer. He spent the year suited up for most of the games behind Gus Frerotte and Jeff Hostetler, but he never appeared in a game that season. He went back to the Rams a couple times, and most notably the 2001 and then 2002 season. He had some starts in 2002 for the injured Mark Bulger. Okay, now getting back on track, this is Sage Rosenfels as we go to 2001. Marty Schottenheimer selected Rosenfels out of Iowa State, and the Cyclone was taken in the 4th round that year. He won a job as the 3rd string quarterback behind, first Jeff George, but after Jeff George was released, he was behind Tony Banks and Kent Graham, both mentioned earlier. Rosenfels was similar to Babe Laufenberg in that he was very successful that preseason and had some popularity with the fans, but he never appeared in a game as a Redskin. That was his only season in the Burgundy and Gold. He then played for the Miami Dolphins, Texans, Vikings, Giants in spurts. He did have 30 starts in the NFL. Not 30 starts. 30 touchdown passes, but he had 12 starts in the NFL. Sage Rosenfels. And he was the primary backup to Brett Favre in Minnesota. Okay, here's one that bears mentioning, even though he did not make the team. This is Jordan Palmer, a 6th round pick, a wasted draft pick in 2007 by Joe Gibbs out of UTEP. He was cut in early September and did not even make the team. he ended up being a backup behind his brother Carson Palmer for a few years in Cincinnati, and then bounced around with a few other teams. And he only attempted 18 passes in the NFL. Of course, none with the Redskins. Okay, this is Colt Brennan. And so in 2008, for the second draft in a row, the Redskins spent a 6th-round pick on a quarterback. This time Jim Zorn was the head coach in 2008. And he spent it on Brennan, who set all sorts of records at the University of Hawaii. He was very good in the preseason in a couple of games, and he ended up making the team as the 3rd quarterback behind Jason Campbell and Todd Collins, but he did not appear in a regular season game in 2008. In 2009, he again made the team, but he was put on injured reserve for the majority of the season, the bad injury. And he never threw. He went to the Raiders after that, but he never appeared in an NFL game in his career, and unfortunately he passed away in 2021. All right, next is Richard Bartell. So that 2009 season, Jim Zorn's last with the Redskins. Bartell, who played at Tarleton State in college, he was signed off the Jaguars practice squad to be the 3rd stringer for the Redskins in late November of 2009 to the end of the season. But when Zorn was fired in the offseason and Mike Shanahan took over, Bartell was gone. He did throw about 30 passes in the NFL, 50 passes in the NFL, all with the Cardinals. And he threw 1 touchdown pass. All right, Jonathan Crompton is next. The Redskins chose to carry just 2 quarterbacks, and I use the term QBs lightly since we're talking about John Beck and Rex Grossman. In 2011, under Mike Shanahan, they cut veteran Kellen Clemens in the preseason, so I will not include Clemens on this list. And they went with former Tennessee Volunteer Crompton as insurance, and they stuck him on the practice squad for the 2011 season. Crompton never threw a pass in the NFL. This is Pat White. So Pat White was a 2nd-round pick of the Miami Dolphins in 2009. He also played for the Virginia Destroyers of the UFL in 2011. He was a bright spot for the Redskins in the 2013 preseason. He was showcasing his running and passing skills so well that Shanahan made the rare move of carving out a roster spot for him as the 4th quarterback for Week 1 of the 2013 season. However, he was waived the next week, and he made a brief attempt at a Major League Baseball career. All right, take a look at Nate Sudfeld. He's best known as the guy that Eagles coach Doug Peterson subbed in for Jalen Hurts versus Washington in 2020 to allegedly throw the game for a better draft choice, and gave the Washington football team the division title. But Sudfeld was originally drafted in round 6 by the Redskins back in 2016, spending that season as the 3rd stringer but never seeing any action. He did get a ring with Philadelphia, as well as throw a TD pass to beat the Skins at FedEx Field that same year in a revenge game. And currently he's on the 49ers practice squad. All right, Steven Montez is number 6 here, seen standing beside Alex Smith. The 6'5" Colorado Buffalo was passed up in the 2020 draft and quickly inked by the Washington football team, who had just released Colt McCoy and Case Keenum. He was signed to the active roster in the final 3 games of the 2020 season following the departure of Dwayne Haskins. When Alex Smith was ruled inactive for the wildcard game, Montez became the 2nd quarterback on the depth chart. Taylor Heineke injured his shoulder in the 4th quarter of that playoff game and NBC cameras showed Montez warming up on the sidelines. However, Heineke was able to return and finish the game. Montez was cut in the 2021 preseason and has since been on the Lions practice squad. All right, Kyle Shermer, who is shown here as a Cincinnati Bengal. So after Ryan Fitzpatrick was deemed inactive for several weeks due to a hip injury in week 1 of the 2021 season, Kyle Shermer was signed to the Washington football team practice squad. The undrafted quarterback from Vanderbilt had initially spent some time with Kansas City and Cincinnati. He was dressed but inactive for a few games with Washington in 2021, and one fan even recently noted how much better a passer he appeared to be than Taylor Heineke and Kyle Allen in the pregame warm-ups. After the season, he left to be a assistant coach with Vanderbilt. All right, and the last quarterback on this list is Jordan Ta'amu, who came out originally in 2019, undrafted to the Texans. Now, when the Washington football team lost Taylor Heineke and Kyle Allen due to COVID protocol late in the 2021 season, and they started Garrett Gilbert in a game, they signed Jordan Ta'amu to the practice squad, and he was released 8 days later. The Hawaiian quarterback who played at Ole Miss was then picked up by the Panthers, and he is currently with the Tampa Bay Bandits of the newly reformed USFL. So that's a look at the Washington Redskins, Washington football team, all the quarterbacks of that franchise from November of 1985 up to January of 2022. This season, since the season has not started, of course, the Washington Commanders will feature Carson Wentz, Taylor Heineke, and probably one more, since Kyle Allen has since gone to the Texans. This list has included 38 different starting quarterbacks. So by sobering comparison to this enormous list, the Green Bay Packers, since the injury to Don Majkowski in 1992, have had 449 of the possible 466 starts come from either Brett Favre or Aaron Rodgers. And that doesn't include the 42 starts that those two quarterbacks combined to make in the playoffs from 1993 to 2020. During that same time, Washington has had quarterbacks make a paltry 8 postseason starts. All right, so let's be straight. No follower of this franchise honestly wants to lock down a Josh Allen type for the next 15 years. They say they do, but they don't. It would be similar to when the Cubs finally won it all in 2016. The fans celebrated, but deep down, they would have rather lost in 7 and remained grounded in their familiar, lovable identity. Most likely, Washington fans will be treated to another string of burned-out has-beens, a couple of more first-round busts, and a few Johnny Tryhards cut from the same cloth as Keenum and Heineke. But that's the sampler platter that we know, understand, and have a relationship with. It's comfort food. It's mac and cheese and jalapeno poppers. It's home. And the fans wouldn't have it any other way. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you for part 3 somewhere down the road.